Ongoing Colombia supported by Brazil, Peru, United States, Spain, United Kingdom, paramilitaries, guerrillas, Ivan Duque Marquez, FARC, Timoleon Jimenez, Ivan Marquez, Joaquin Gomez, Mauricio Jaramillo. The Colombian conflict and the Popular Liberation Army, fighting each other to increase their influence in Colombian territory. Some of the most important international contributors to the Colombian conflict include multinational corporations, the United States, Cuba, and the drug trafficking industry. It is historically rooted in the conflict known as La Violencia, which was triggered by the 1948 assassination of liberal political leader Jorge Eliezer Gaitán, and in the aftermath of the anti-communist repression in rural Colombia in the 1960s that led liberal and communist militants to reorganize into FARC. The reasons for fighting vary from group to group. The FARC and other guerrilla movements claim to be fighting for the rights of the poor in Colombia, to protect them from government violence and to provide social justice through communism. The Colombian government claims to be fighting for order and stability, and to protect the rights and interests of its citizens. The paramilitary groups claim to be reacting to perceived threats by guerrilla movements. According to a study by Colombia's National Center for Historical Memory, 220,000 people have died in the conflict between 1958 and 2013. Most of them civilians, and more than 5 million civilians were forced from their homes between 1985 and 2012, generating the world's second largest population of internally displaced persons. 16.9% of the population in Colombia has been a direct victim of the war. 2.3 million children have been displaced from their homes, and 45,000 children killed, according to national figures cited by UNICEF. In total, 1 in 3 of the 7.6 million registered victims of the conflict are children. And since 1985, 8,000 minors have disappeared. A special unit was created to search for persons deemed as missing within the context of and due to the armed conflict. On June 23, 2016, the Colombian government and the FARC rebels signed a historic ceasefire deal, bringing them closer to ending more than 5 decades of conflict. Although the deal was rejected in the subsequent October plebiscite, the same month, President of Colombia Juan Manuel Santos was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to bring the country's more than 50-year-long civil war to an end. A revised peace deal was signed the following month and submitted to Congress for approval. The House of Representatives unanimously approved the plan on November 30, a day after the Senate also gave its backing. The armed conflict in Colombia emerged due to a combination of economic, political and social factors in the country. Various organizations and scholars that have studied the conflict trace it back to a long history of political violence, a high social and economic inequality, the lack of strong state capable of providing for its citizens, and the end of La Violencia. Meanwhile, others believe it was in 1964 with the creation of the FARC and the end of the National Front. Some scholars even trace it back to the 1920s, with the unequal distribution of land in the country which has been one of the main causes and disputes of the conflict throughout the years. In the early period, guerrilla groups like the FARC, the ELN and others adopted a slogan of greater equality through communism, which came to be supported by many people, mostly in low-income and rural areas of the country. Citation needed. During these years, the violence was low in intensity and occurred mainly in remote parts of the country. However, the balance of power and influence shifted in the mid-1980s when Colombia granted greater political and fiscal autonomy to local governments, strengthening the position of the Colombian government in more remote regions of the country. In 1985, during peace talks between President Belisario Betancourt and the FARC, the armed group co-created the left-wing Patriotic Union political party as a path to leave violence behind and eventually move into politics. However, between 1985 and 2002, right-wing paramilitaries, with the help and support from parts of the government, murdered and disappeared 4,153 members and supporters of the party, including 2 presidential candidates, 6 of 16 congressmen, 17 regional representatives and 163 councilmen. This systematic killing decimated the organization and aggravated the broader conflict. In the 1980s, the level of violence increased in many parts of the country as a result of the beginning of the drug trafficking. Trafficking had begun in the 1960s and 70s, when a group of Americans began to smuggle marijuana. Later, the American mafia began to establish drug trafficking in Colombia in cooperation with local marijuana producers. Cocaine manufactured in Colombia were historically mostly consumed in the US as well as Europe. Organize